Bobcat mother rejects her rare white kitten for looking different. What follows will shock you. The forest should have echoed with a mother's call. Instead, it fell silent. A bobcat had turned her back on one of her own, a newborn unlike the others. The tiny body shivered in the grass, its fur pale as winter ash, its cry thin as a thread about to snap. And the mother walked away, swift, deliberate, without hesitation. Why would she leave it? What law of survival demands that difference be cast aside? No answer came, only the hush of pine and the damp breath of morning pressing down on a life already marked for ending. The kitten's chest rose in uneven rhythm, each breath so fragile it seemed the forest might snuff it out with the slightest wind. Its whiteness, rare and unprotected, made it visible against every shadow. Vulnerable, exposed, and utterly alone. From the tree line, a figure slowed. A man, his boots heavy with mud, his jacket darkened by mist, had not come searching for this. Yet his eyes found it, the lone pulse of white against a bed of green, and he stopped as though the earth itself had told him to wait. He did not move at first. To step forward was to break a barrier, to intervene in what nature had already decided. But the cry came again, small, fractured, pleading. Not the roar of survival, but the whisper of surrender. It threaded through the quiet, and something inside him tightened. He crouched. The damp earth bled cold into his knees. Before him lay a creature no larger than his palm, trembling with the weight of its own existence. He reached out, then froze. Was he about to cross a line the wild had drawn? Or was he the only line left between life and silence? The kitten shifted weakly, its paw brushing the toe of his boot. The touch was almost nothing, and yet in that small contact, the hesitation dissolved. He gathered it into his hands, careful as though holding a flame that could vanish with one wrong breath. Pressed to his chest, the kitten's warmth barely registered, but the rhythm of his heart met its fragile gasps, steadying them. In that unspoken exchange, pulse answering pulse, the forest seemed to lean closer. No sound broke the moment. The crow that had been watching lifted silently into the sky. The branches swayed, the mist thickened, and the world resumed its indifference. But for the man holding the rare white kitten, everything shifted. This was no ordinary rescue. This was the beginning of a bond carved not from choice, but from rejection and chance. Could he keep it alive? Could love outlast what nature had denied? Or had he only delayed the inevitable, carrying a heartbeat already fading? He did not know. But he walked on, the pale body cradled against him, each step asking the question the story itself would have to answer. The drive back to his cabin cut through a stretch of forest road where mist lingered low, curling like smoke across the gravel. He held the kitten close against his chest, the engine's hum steady beneath the faint tremors of its breathing. The cabin was simple, weathered by years of storms and seasons, a place meant for solitude. Yet as he pushed open the door, carrying the fragile weight in his hands, the air inside felt different, less empty, almost expectant. He laid the kitten on an old wool blanket near the hearth. Its fur was still damp, clinging to the contours of its ribs. For a moment he simply watched, unsure if warmth alone could coax life forward. The firewood crackled softly, filling the silence with a rhythm that seemed to sync with the kitten's shallow breaths. Each rise and fall was uneven, as though the tiny chest had to fight for every ounce of air. Hours passed in fragments. He fed it carefully, a few drops at a time, wiping away the spill with cloth. At first it resisted, too weak to swallow, its head lolling as though gravity itself pressed too heavy. But then, unexpectedly, the kitten latched, the faintest surge of will flickering through its body. He exhaled sharply, the tension breaking, though he didn't realize he had been holding his breath. That was the first twist, the will to live where there should have been surrender. Daylight slipped through the cabin's single window, shifting across the floor in long rectangles of pale gold. The man kept his movements quiet, each action measured, adding a log to the fire, setting down a cup, adjusting the blanket around the small form. He did not speak. Words felt irrelevant, almost intrusive. Instead, he listened. The hush of flames, the kitten's faint breaths, the subtle rhythm of survival unfolding in silence. As days began to stack, a pattern emerged. The kitten, once limp and motionless, began to stir at his presence. A glance here, a weak shift of paws there, small routines that spoke louder than any sound. The man who had built his life on distance and stillness now found his attention narrowing to the smallest of signals, a flicker of an ear, the twitch of a whisker, the way its body curled tighter when the night grew colder. And yet, a mystery began to surface. At times, the kitten would stare fixedly toward the window, its pale eyes following something unseen. Not the sway of branches or the shadow of passing birds, but something else. Something that stilled its body completely, ears forward, as though listening to a call only it could hear. The man would follow its gaze and find nothing. No movement, no sound, only the weight of quiet pressing against the glass. The unease settled in him, though he said nothing of it, even to himself. Was the kitten searching for the mother who had abandoned it? Or was there something deeper, some instinct pulling it back toward the wild, toward the place where rejection had begun? Nights were harder. The fire's glow waned, and the forest pressed close around the cabin walls. The man would wake to soft cries, not loud enough to disturb the silence, but sharp enough to cut through sleep. He would rise, lift the kitten gently, hold it against his chest until the cries quieted into small vibrations of breath. In those hours, with only the crackle of cooling embers and the faint tremor of life in his arms, he felt a shift within himself. The solitude he had once chosen no longer felt the same. And then came the second twist. One morning, as he bent to feed it, the kitten recoiled, not with fear, but with sudden, jarring strength. Its tiny body twisted away, teeth flashing briefly as it released a sound he had never heard before, sharp and wild. The cry echoed against the cabin walls, startling in its rawness. For a heartbeat, it was not a fragile orphan, but a creature of the forest, fierce and unyielding. The man froze, spoon in hand, eyes locked with the pale glint of its gaze. The moment passed quickly. Exhaustion reclaimed the kitten, its body collapsing once more into weakness. But the impression lingered. What had surfaced in that cry? A warning, a memory, or simply the wild reminding him that no matter how fragile it seemed, this life was never truly his to claim? He sat back, the silence heavy. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low, restless sigh. And within that cabin, the bond between man and kitten deepened, not through comfort alone, but through the mystery and defiance threaded into its fragile survival. The days ahead would not be simple. Already the questions had begun to grow. Why had the mother turned away from a life so determined to exist? What unseen thread was the kitten following when it stared through the window into nothing? And how long could he, a single man in the solitude of the woods, hold the balance between the wild's rejection and his own fragile attempt at rescue? No answers came, only the steady rise and fall of the kitten's chest, as if time itself was waiting to decide. The rhythm of days settled into something fragile but familiar. The man rose with the gray light that slipped through the pines, moved quietly through his cabin, and always paused first at the blanket near the hearth. There, the white kitten would be waiting, sometimes stirring weakly, sometimes lying still until his shadow fell across it, and then it would lift its head as though recognizing more than just presence. Recognition was not expected in the wild, yet it lingered here in every glance. He carried the kitten with him during small routines. While he chopped wood, it rested inside his jacket, the faint thrum of its heart pressed against his chest. While he walked the narrow trail to the stream, its pale head peeked out, ears twitching to the trickle of water and the far calls of birds. It seemed to learn the sound of his breath, the pattern of his steps, the way stillness could mean safety, and yet that mystery grew stronger. At dusk, as the forest dimmed into shadows, the kitten would fix its gaze toward the same stretch of trees beyond the window. Its body stilled completely, as though listening to something that pulsed beneath the silence. The man followed its line of sight many times, yet saw nothing, only the shifting of branches and the slow darkening of sky. Still, the intensity unsettled him. What did it hear? What did it know that he could not? One evening, as twilight seeped into the cabin, he held the kitten close and stood by the window, allowing its eyes to guide him. For a long moment, the pale creature remained rigid, ears forward. And then, without warning, it released a sound not of weakness, but of yearning, a faint cry that carried beyond the glass into the woods. His chest tightened. Was it calling out to the mother that had left it? Or was it calling to something else, something older, something he would never understand? That was the first twist, the voice of longing breaking through survival, piercing the silence with a question no human could answer. The days grew colder. He stoked the fire more often, wrapped the kitten in thicker folds of wool, and watched as strength began to ripple beneath its frailty. Its paws pressed firmer against the blanket. Its body lifted more steadily when it walked short, trembling steps across the wooden floor. Progress was slow, almost invisible day to day, yet undeniable when he remembered how limp it had once been in his hands. And then came the second twist. One morning, he found the kitten outside the blanket for the first time. It had dragged itself toward the door, leaving faint lines of disturbed dust on the floorboards. He stood there staring at the tiny body leaning against the wooden frame, its nose pressed to the cold gap beneath the door. The sight stirred something complex. Hope, because it showed a will to move beyond weakness. And unease, because it seemed drawn to the wilderness that had rejected it. He bent down, lifted it gently, and pressed it against his chest. The kitten's body trembled, not from cold but from something deeper, an instinct that could not be contained within walls. He could feel it in the way its claws flexed faintly against his sleeve, the way its pale eyes flickered restlessly toward the light seeping around the edges of the door. He spoke no words. There was nothing to say. Instead, he sat by the hearth, holding the restless creature, letting its faint vibrations settle into his heartbeat. The fire cracked softly, throwing light across the walls. In that glow, the bond between them deepened, not through comfort alone, but through tension, the pull between safety and the wild, between the warmth of rescue and the call of something larger. Nights returned with their silence. Sometimes he would wake to find the kitten no longer crying but staring, always toward that same window, always toward the trees. The mystery thickened, a quiet thread binding the story, pulling it toward something inevitable, and he, a man who had chosen solitude long ago, now felt the fragile unraveling of his own walls. He was no longer alone, yet he was not certain if what he held was his to keep. Because love in the wild is never possession. It is presence, and presence can be lost. The forest turned harder with the shift of season. Mornings arrived in a hush of frost, breath spilling pale into the air, trees rigid with ice. The man rose each day, slower now, his body reminding him of years carried quietly. But always his first thought was the small white shape curled in the blanket. It had grown, not much in size, but in strength, in presence. Its eyes no longer seemed clouded by frailty. They held something clear, sharp and unyielding, like water breaking through stone. But the mystery remained. At dusk, the kitten's gaze still locked to the trees, its body still tightened as though listening for something beyond human reach. He began to feel it too, a sense that the silence outside was not empty, but layered, watching, waiting. He tried to dismiss it as imagination, yet each time the kitten stiffened at the window, his chest echoed with the same unease. One night, the first twist came like a fracture in glass. The man awoke to a sound, soft, deliberate, inside the cabin. He reached for the fire's embers, coaxing light back into the room. There, on the wooden floor, the kitten was no longer at the hearth. It stood near the door, not stumbling now, but firm, its body low, its eyes burning toward the gap at the threshold. And then he heard it, the faintest sound beyond the wood, almost like an answer. Not wind, not branches. Something alive. His pulse thudded. The kitten pressed its nose to the crack, releasing a cry so sharp it pierced the night. He placed a hand against its body, feeling the tremor ripple through. Outside the silence held, but heavy, as if another heartbeat lay hidden in the dark. The kitten quieted, yet its body remained rigid, unwilling to move from the door. He lifted it at last, pressing it against his chest, carrying it back to the hearth. Still, he could not shake the feeling. This creature did not belong only to him. Something out there called, and it was growing louder. The days after carried that weight. Even when the kitten slept curled in his coat, even when its tiny paws pressed against his skin, the man felt the pull between them stretching thinner. Rescue had saved the body, but the soul was still reaching for the forest. The second twist came with pain, sudden and silent. Returning from the stream one morning, the man opened the door to stillness. The hearth was cold. The blanket lay folded untouched. His breath caught. He searched the cabin, heart striking against his ribs, until he found it, at the very window where it always stared. The kitten had climbed the small table, its paws pressed against the glass, its body trembling with effort. And for the first time, it turned its head toward him. Not in weakness, not in pleading, but in a way that felt like goodbye. The weight of that moment broke something quiet inside him. He had carried this fragile life back from the edge, held it against his own warmth, fed it with patience and silence, and now it looked at him with eyes not of need, but of departure. He sank into the chair by the fire, the kitten still perched at the window, and realized a truth he had tried not to face. Rescue was never possession. It was a bridge, and bridges are built to lead back to the world. That night he left the window unlatched. He did not know if the kitten would climb down, or if it would wait for another day, another call. But he sat in the hush of the firelight, hands resting open, and allowed himself to feel both ache and grace. Because to love something wild is to stand at the edge of release. The first snow came quietly, as if the sky had decided to erase every sound in the forest. White drifted against the windowsill, muffling the world into stillness. The man lit the hearth early, the glow chasing away the chill that crept into his bones. The kitten, no longer fragile, no longer trembling at every step, had grown into a presence he could not ignore. Its fur glowed against the firelight, a rare white that seemed almost born from the snow itself, yet even now, its gaze belonged elsewhere. Each time he opened the door to fetch wood, the kitten pressed forward, nose lifted to the air, ears twitching with an instinct he could not understand. The wild was calling louder, and with it the ache inside him grew. The first twist came without warning. He was stacking wood against the cabin wall when he caught movement beyond the trees. A shadow, low, deliberate. His breath slowed. He stepped forward, boots crunching snow, until the shape revealed itself in a break of branches. A bobcat. Larger, leaner, its coat the mottled brown of the earth, its eyes burning amber. It did not run. It stood still, body taut, gaze fixed not on him but on the cabin behind him. The man turned slowly, following that gaze, and saw the white kitten at the doorway, body rigid, eyes wide, locked to the creature in the snow. The man felt the air shift. Something passed between the two animals, something ancient, something he had no part in. He lifted his hand as if to shield, as if to claim, but his chest tightened with the truth. He could not. The bobcat lowered its head, not in aggression, but in recognition. And then, with the silence of falling snow, it turned back into the forest and vanished. That night, the kitten did not eat. It paced the cabin instead, restless, circling the door. The man watched, torn between fear and understanding, and realized what the forest had revealed. This was not just a rescue. It was a return. The second twist arrived with his choice. Before dawn, he wrapped the kitten gently in his coat and stepped into the snow. His breath hung heavy in the frozen air, his boots breaking a path toward the trees. The forest received them in silence, branches bending under white weight. He stopped at the clearing, the same one where he had first found it. He knelt, setting the kitten down, his hands trembling against its warmth. For a moment, the kitten stayed pressed against him, its fur brushing his wrist, its body unwilling to leave the shelter it had known, and then it stepped forward. One paw, then another into the snow. Its body turned once, eyes lifting to his face with something unspoken, trust, memory, gratitude, and then it moved toward the trees. The man stayed kneeling, snow melting into his skin, watching as the rare white shape disappeared into the vastness of the wild. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Yet beneath the ache, a strange stillness settled inside him, because sacrifice was not loss. It was love, stretched wide enough to let go. The cabin felt larger in the days that followed, its silence no longer filled by the soft rhythm of tiny paws or the low hum of breath curled in the blankets. The man still rose before dawn, still placed wood on the fire, still walked to the stream for water. But each movement carried an absence, a hollow where a small white presence had once been. He told himself it was what love required, to give back what was never his to keep. Yet at night, when the wind pressed against the cabin walls and the forest whispered beyond the glass, he felt the weight of a question he could never answer. Had it survived? Had it found what it was looking for? Winter deepened, and with it, his quiet ache. Days passed without sign, until one evening, while he sat at the window with the fire's glow behind him, he felt it, a shift in the air. He turned slowly, breath caught in his chest. At the edge of the clearing, between the trees heavy with snow, a shape appeared. Not large, not fierce. Small, white, moving with the grace of something no longer weak, no longer fragile. The kitten, no, not a kitten now, but something stronger, stood watching him from the shadow of the trees. The first twist came with what followed. From behind the white figure, another shape emerged. The same mottled bobcat, amber-eyed, stepping silently into the clearing. The man's heart struck hard against his ribs. The two animals stood side by side, wild and untouchable, yet whole. For a moment that stretched wider than time, the rare white creature turned its gaze to him, steady and unflinching. There was no cry, no sound, only the stillness of recognition. The bond they had shared had not broken with distance, it had transformed, carried now in the unspoken space between them. And then the white figure lifted its head, pressed briefly against the larger bobcat, and together they turned, vanishing back into the forest. The second twist was not in their return, but in his realization. He did not need proof of their survival, nor closeness to feel their presence. What had once been fragile had found strength. What had once been dependent had found freedom. And in that freedom lay the answer to the question that had haunted him. Rescue was never about saving a life for yourself. It was about saving it for the world. He sat back, the fire crackling at his shoulder, the night pressing softly against the glass. His chest still ached, but differently now, not with loss, but with reverence. Because love had taken shape in his life for a brief season, and then taught him the hardest, most beautiful lesson of all, that to hold something wild is to hold it lightly, and to let it go when the world calls it home. In the silence of the cabin, he closed his eyes, the memory of white fur brushing his hands, the weight of trust in fragile breaths. It lingered not as emptiness, but as a truth that would never leave him. And somewhere beyond the trees, under the hush of snow, two figures moved as one, wild, free, eternal.